For Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. Last year, Nova Scotians were saddened to hear media reports about those in care suffering from bed sores. Great work has been done by healthcare workers to prevent more of these incidents, but little has been noted publicly. It was reassuring to hear in March that $2.5 million was being spent on the purchase of special equipment to address bed sores in long-term care, but frankly, I found it embarrassing because this was long overdue that you were expecting staff to be working without the appropriate equipment. Since the announcement of that funding, there has been little else said. Does the Minister of Health understand what those in long-term care know? That pressure sores in the province of Nova Scotia are going to continue to increase if his department doesn't identify and fund the appropriate number of staff in our long-term care facilities.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate that the member acknowledged the good work that's been done over the past year with regard to steps being taken to, again, improve the quality of care, in this case specifically related to bed sores for people living in our long-term care facilities. I think it's unfortunate that the member thinks there's little else that she'd heard. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we've taken steps to, for the first time, track these conditions, Mr. Speaker, throughout our facilities. And, Mr. Speaker, what I can advise the members, we've seen a reduction of almost 13 or 14% year over year from June to June, which was publicly posted. We'll continue to publicly post this data, Mr. Speaker. That helps us, Mr. Speaker, to improve, again, the quality of care and to identify where we need to focus our efforts.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many industries, our seniors care industry is facing staffing shortages. These shortages were highlighted this year by the expert panel on long-term care earlier this year that we've been talking about, where they identified the staffing as one of their main concerns. I'll allude to this, the #1 concern. Many of these cases of bed sores can be traced back to staffing shortages. Despite the best efforts of staff, if there aren't enough people to get the job done, it's going to take a lot longer to solve the problem. These staffing shortages aren't a new problem, but they don't seem to be the focus of the investment in the way the experts have recommended. How many new staff have been hired since the long-term care report? How many net new staff have been hired by the Department of Health and Wellness since the long-term care report was released?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't hire the staff in these facilities, Mr. Speaker. Staff are hired by the long-term care providers. Mr. Speaker, obviously the member and I would disagree in the member's suggestion that we're not fulfilling the recommendations from the expert panel in the manner in which they suggested. Mr. Speaker, in fact, we had representatives from the panel when we presented the update to Nova Scotians earlier in September of this year, Mr. Speaker, and they made it very clear that they're very pleased with the progress of the work we continue to do with those representatives and others within the industry, Mr. Speaker. And as far as improving access, one of those recommendations, because the panel recognized that it would take time in order to build the workforce availability to fill the vacancies that exist, that there's a need for a new position, Mr. Speaker. That was one of the announcements we made in September as well, just as was recommended.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, staffing shortages in long-term care facilities lead to dangerous working environments for both the caregivers and the care receivers. That's why the expert panel on long-term care identified staffing shortages as a top priority, although they failed to establish the recommended staffing levels. Reports have shown that CCAs working in long-term care facilities and nurses have the highest rate of job injury of any occupation in the province. Overworked staff are often more susceptible to injury, and short staffing often leads to being overworked. We believe that the identification of appropriate staffing levels and funding of such levels is critical to reducing the injury rate of staff in long-term care facilities. So I'm wondering if the minister believes that staffing shortages are causing the high rate of job injury in long-term care, and if his government is going to mandate that the long-term care panel come back to him with what he originally asked, which was appropriate staffing levels for long-term care.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I appreciate that the member sees the value of the work that was done and the steps that this government took a year ago in establishing the expert long-term panel, recognizing the qualifications and the expertise of the members of that panel and the advice and the recommendations they've made. Mr. Speaker, where we seem to disagree is that the member seems to continue to think that we're somehow not following those recommendations. Indeed, we're following those recommendations and the advice, and if she reviews back to that panel and the recommendations, what they'd identified was that there's a need to identify, Mr. Speaker, not just a defined number, but rather a change in the system in terms of identifying the needs, the number and the type of support people in long-term care, Mr. Speaker, based upon the needs of the individuals in a given facility. And that work, Mr. Speaker, is a very significant change, requires additional work, and that work is ongoing in partnership with other organizations.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to advise the minister that I know exactly what the Expert Advisory Panel on Long-Term Care Update report said. I have it right here. I'll table it in case the minister would like to have another look. Mr. Speaker, opening up the express entry immigration stream to caregiving professions is a first step in addressing the staffing shortages, and I applaud that. Reinstating the Nova Scotia Community College bursary was also a good step, although we've since learned that it's only temporary. The problem is those solutions only help the CCAs of tomorrow. Under the NDP government, the CCA training with that grant program rose from 500 per year to 1,000 per year for several years. Then this government stopped it immediately upon taking over. So we've been under-training CCAs by almost 500 per year. So that's what, over 6 years? Do the math. My question to the Minister of Health is, does he think that applying a grant for 115 people for the CCA grant program is going to compensate for the thousands and thousands that were untrained over the last 6 years that his government has been in power?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased again that we can agree in the legislature the importance of the recommendations and the fact that the recommendations coming from the panel members indeed it presents a roadmap for us to follow as government to focus our efforts, Mr. Speaker, in the areas that will provide the biggest improvements in providing what was fundamentally the mandate to the expert panel, improve the quality of care for residents in our long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker. That is what we asked that panel to do. That is what the focus of the recommendations within that panel came out with. And, Mr. Speaker, we can see very clearly the progress we've made in returning the bursary, Mr. Speaker. We've expanded and made investments, Mr. Speaker, in care and training. We've increased advertising, Mr. Speaker, and we've been out engaging and continuing the work in the longer-term initiatives that they've highlighted.